It was a humid, late summer evening when I realized that the most ordinary plans could sometimes spiral into a nightmare. My name is Emily, and I had just finished my first year of college. Like any young adult with a newly acquired taste for freedom, I was eager to escape the monotony of city life and take a short trip with a few friends. It was meant to be an adventure, something to mark the end of exams, a pause between semesters, and a chance to breathe in the wilderness. None of us had imagined that what we thought would be a carefree camping weekend would turn into something terrifyingly real. Our group consisted of 4 of us: myself, Rachel, Aaron, and Max. We'd all been friends since high school, and there was a natural rhythm to our interactions. We shared the same humor, the same impatience for boredom, and an equal desire to push boundaries. Our plan was simple: rent a cabin in the forests of northern Michigan for the weekend, a small wooden structure tucked away from the main roads, surrounded by tall pines and the promise of tranquility. We had each brought what we thought was necessary: sleeping bags, a few packs of food, some beers, and of course, our phones, though we knew reception would be limited. That only added to the thrill. We arrived at dusk, the sun barely grazing the treetops as we parked by the cabin. The air smelled of pine needles and wet earth, a scent both fresh and oddly foreboding. Rachel immediately started unpacking, while Max and Aaron argued about who should start the fire. I stayed back for a moment, looking up at the trees, feeling a shiver run down my spine. There was something about the way the shadows stretched across the forest floor that made it feel alive, though I tried to shake it off, attributing it to fatigue and the excitement of the trip. The cabin itself was small, rustic, and barely modern, which was part of the appeal. Wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a single bathroom, and a loft where the beds were stacked like a puzzle. Rachel and I claimed the loft, while Max and Aaron took the ground floor. By the time the sun disappeared completely, the forest was silent, but for the occasional rustle of leaves. The darkness seemed to stretch further than the light could ever reach, swallowing the edges of the clearing in shadows. After dinner, a mix of canned chili and stale bread, we decided to sit around the fire with a couple of beers. The conversation flowed easily at first, light teasing, laughter, and memories of past misadventures. But as the night deepened, there was a pause, almost imperceptible, as if the forest itself was waiting. I remember the moment distinctly. Rachel had gone inside to grab more marshmallows, and it was just the 3 of us. Max was leaning back on a log, staring into the fire, and Aaron was tossing small sticks into it, watching them curl and blacken. I felt eyes on me, though. I couldn't place them. That's weird. I said, my voice just above a whisper. I feel like someone's out there watching us. Aaron chuckled dismissively. It's just the woods, Emily. Shadows play tricks on you. I know, I muttered, but the pit in my stomach refused to calm. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I felt a cold breeze, unusual for a summer night. Max noticed my unease. Hey, it's fine, he said, trying to reassure me. We've got the fire, the cabin, the woods are miles from anyone else. Nothing's gonna happen. But then we heard it, a faint snapping of twigs, somewhere beyond the reach of the firelight. It was slow, deliberate, and it didn't sound like an animal. Max froze, the log in his hand quivering slightly. Aaron stopped tossing sticks, ears straining. Silence fell, broken only by the occasional pop from the fire. Probably a deer or something, Aaron said, but his voice lacked conviction. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there. The sound came again, closer this time, not random, but deliberate. Step, pause, step. It wasn't walking through underbrush. It was moving cautiously, measured, watching us. Rachel returned then, holding a bag of marshmallows. laughing about how I looked like I was preparing to run for my life. "What's wrong with you guys?" she asked, but her laughter faded when she noticed our expressions. "Did you hear that?" Before anyone could answer, a shadow flickered past the tree line. We all froze. My heart slammed against my ribs, adrenaline pumping faster than it ever had. Max whispered, "Stay calm. Maybe it's someone else camping nearby." But the forest around us remained unnervingly still. The snapping sounds had stopped, replaced by a different noise, soft footsteps crunching on dead leaves, circling the clearing. We debated calling out, but the forest seemed to absorb sound, making any attempt to communicate futile. Our phones were nearly useless. No bars, no signal. I suggested we go inside, but as we moved toward the cabin, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, tall, wearing a hooded sweatshirt that hid most of his face. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost predatory. Aaron froze mid-step, and Max instinctively stepped in front of us, trying to gauge his intentions. "Evening," the man said, voice low and calm, but it carried a threatening undertone. "Nice spot you've got here." Rachel, trying to mask her fear, smiled nervously. "Thanks. We're just here for the weekend." He nodded slowly. "I can see that." He tilted his head, eyes scanning the firelight, lingering on us with unsettling interest. "You folks alone?" "Yes," Max said firmly, though I noticed his hands were shaking slightly. The man's gaze flicked to the cabin, and my stomach dropped. There was a pause, a long, suffocating silence where I expected him to move on, to vanish into the darkness, but he didn't. Instead, he stepped closer. "Mind if I—" "Stay a while?" "No," Aaron blurted, his voice cracking. The man's eyes locked on him, and he smiled faintly, a cruel, knowing smile. I can't explain the instinct that kicked in, the primal urge to run, but something about his demeanor made it clear he was not here to chat. I grabbed Rachel's arm, pulling her back. Max and Aaron moved to block the cabin entrance, but it was futile. The man advanced, slow, confident, like a predator who knows its prey has nowhere to escape. Rachel whispered, "We need to get inside." Now, we rushed into the cabin, slamming the door behind us, locking it, but the sounds outside didn't stop. There was pacing, circling, and then the scratching against the wooden walls of the cabin. Whoever this man was, he knew exactly where to strike fear. Our safe haven felt suddenly fragile, paper, thin against the night outside. We huddled together, adrenaline surging and hearts pounding in unison. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of wind against the cabin walls felt like a threat. The fire outside had dimmed, and with it our comfort. We were alone, completely exposed, with a presence we couldn't see fully, but could feel, pressing against the thin barrier of our flimsy refuge. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity. The man eventually retreated, though we didn't know when, leaving behind only the echo of footsteps fading into the distance. Morning light revealed the marks he'd left. A single footprint on the porch, scratches on the wooden siding, and the lingering sense of violation. Nothing was taken, yet we were all left shaken, unable to speak, absorb, or comprehend fully what had happened. We left the cabin without a word, not daring to look back. The forest that had seemed inviting just a day before now felt like a living entity, watching, waiting, holding secrets it had no intention of revealing. Even weeks later, I couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes in the dark, the deliberate pacing, and the knowledge that the man had chosen to appear, and had chosen to leave on his own terms. It's strange how ordinary events, camping trips, nights around a fire, laughter and conversation can pivot so quickly into terror. That night, my perception of safety, of trust, and of the isolation of the wilderness was forever altered. Even today, whenever I smell pine or hear a twig snap unexpectedly, I'm transported back to that night, the sensation of being watched, the dread, and the raw realization of how vulnerable we truly were. The day after the encounter, we drove in silence for hours, only stopping briefly for gas or food, though the mundane act of eating felt almost surreal after what we had experienced. Rachel kept glancing over her shoulder, her hands gripping the steering wheel as if expecting him to appear at any moment. Even Max, who usually wore confidence like armor, was quieter than I'd ever seen him. Aaron kept muttering about calling the police, but we knew there was little they could do without evidence, and our story would sound like something out of a horror movie. Despite the terror of the previous night, something inside me insisted we analyze what had happened. Why had he approached us? Why had he left without harming us? There was a sense of calculation in his movements, a pattern that felt almost ritualistic. We speculated on motives. Was he a local who had seen too many trespassers? A psychopathic drifter with no clear agenda? Or something darker, something that defied reason? None of us had an answer, only an uneasy understanding that the world was far less predictable than we liked to believe. Weeks passed, but the shadow of that night lingered. We avoided forests, camping trips, even long walks in the park. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, and even the innocent sound of children playing outside our windows became a potential threat. Sleep came in fits, with dreams filled with shadows, unrecognizable faces, and the slow, deliberate pacing of that man. One evening, about a month later, I received a message on social media that made my blood run cold. It was from an account I didn't recognize, no profile picture, no friends in common. The message was short, simple, and utterly chilling. "I see you." My hands shook as I showed Rachel and Max. Aaron refused to look, insisting he didn't want to know. But the weight of the message was undeniable. The memory of his hooded figure, the slow, measured steps around the fire, came rushing back. The words weren't just a threat. They were proof that he had been paying attention, watching more than just that weekend. We immediately took precautions, changing routines, updating security settings, and trying to rationalize the message as a prank. But the unease never left. We started noticing things that we hadn't before. A shadow outside the window at night, the faint crunch of leaves in the early morning, the feeling that we were being followed even on crowded streets. The horror of that night had spilled into our daily lives, and no amount of logic could explain why or how. It escalated one evening when I was home alone. I had just returned from work, and the house was quiet, almost unnaturally so. My dog, normally energetic and playful, refused to move from the corner of the living room, staring at the doorway with fur standing on end. I tried to reassure myself, muttering about nerves, about coincidence. Then I saw a figure outside the window, barely visible in the dim streetlight, just standing there, watching. I froze, unable to call for help, my throat constricted with fear. The figure didn't move for several minutes before vanishing into the shadows. I ran to the neighbor's house, banging on the door until someone answered. They looked at me like I was crazy, dismissing my panic as an overactive imagination. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew it wasn't the last time. Rachel and I eventually decided to confront the reality of what was happening. We retraced our steps, reviewing social media interactions, retracing the weekend, and piecing together everything that felt odd or out of place. The more we dug, the more we realized that our experience wasn't random. This man had a pattern. He chose his victims, studied them, and reveled in the fear he induced. That weekend in the cabin was not a chance encounter. It was the beginning of a game we hadn't agreed to play. Max, determined to protect us, insisted we install cameras around our homes, alerted local authorities, and even spoke to private security. But there was a lingering truth none of us could shake. He was always one step ahead. Every precaution we took seemed futile in the face of someone who existed in the shadows, someone who thrived on watching, waiting, and tormenting from afar. Months turned into years, and the memory of that night never faded. The cabin, the forest, the firelight, and the hooded figure became etched into our collective psyche. Each of us changed in subtle ways. Our trust in strangers eroded, our sense of safety forever compromised. We no longer laughed freely in the woods, no longer felt at ease in places where nature should have been comforting. Every rustle, every unexplained sound became a reminder of how vulnerable we truly were. Even now, I find myself revisiting that night in my mind. I can see the way the fire cast shadows across the trees, hear the slow, deliberate crunch of his steps, and feel the icy grip of fear that froze us in place. I often wonder what might have happened if we had reacted differently, if we had confronted him, or if we had screamed. But those thoughts are fleeting, replaced by a harsher reality. Sometimes, surviving is not about fighting or understanding. It's about enduring, about learning to live with the knowledge that there are predators in the world who operate unseen and unchallenged. I have never returned to that cabin, and I doubt I ever will. The forest remains dense and beautiful, but to me, it is a reminder of the night when terror became tangible, when the ordinary transformed into the unimaginable. That night taught me that horror is not always fictional. It exists in the real world, in the shadows, in the glances we don't see, and the footsteps we can't hear until it's too late. It began as an ordinary summer road trip, the kind most people look forward to after months of confinement and routine. My name is Emma, and I had just turned 21 when my older brother, Jason, and I decided to drive across the Midwest to visit our aunt in Michigan. Nothing about the trip suggested danger. In fact, it felt like the perfect escape. The sun was warm, the wind in our hair, and our playlists a seamless mix of classic rock and indie tracks. We had snacks stacked on the passenger seat, iced drinks in the cup holders, and a sense of freedom that comes with leaving your hometown behind. Jason had been driving for hours without pause, the kind of endurance only he seemed capable of. I reclined in the passenger seat, watching the flat fields and endless horizon stretch before us, my mind wandering through memories of childhood summers spent chasing fireflies and swimming in local lakes. There was a kind of innocence to it, a lightness that made the monotony of miles seem trivial. We stopped at a small diner for lunch around noon, the kind that smelled like frying bacon and sugar, dusted donuts. It was charming, and we exchanged stories with the waitress about favorite routes, local legends, and peculiar sights along the road. Nothing at the time suggested we were about to experience something unforgettable. We continued eastward, passing through small towns where the streets were nearly empty and the houses worn with age. By late afternoon, the sun had started to dip low, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. We were approaching a stretch of road Jason had insisted was a shortcut, a winding back road that cut through dense forest rather than taking the main highway. I hesitated, suggesting we stay on the familiar route, but Jason dismissed my concerns. "Trust me," he said, "we'll be there in no time, and it'll be scenic." The forest thickened as we drove deeper. Shadows stretched long across the road, and the familiar sounds of birds and wind shifted into something quieter, more oppressive. It was a silence that seemed unnatural, almost expectant. At first, I told myself it was just the difference between city outskirts and rural woods. But unease began to creep into my chest. Every so often, a figure would appear at the edge of the road too small to be a person. Maybe a deer, but every glance revealed nothing. Still, the feeling persisted, like the woods themselves were watching, judging our intrusion. As night fell, the road narrowed to a single lane with trees pressing in on both sides. Our headlights cut swaths of light into the blackness, illuminating roots and low, hanging branches. Then we saw it, a man standing at the side of the road. His posture was rigid, almost mechanical, and his clothing dark and nondescript. Jason slowed the car, and I instinctively drew back, gripping the dashboard. He raised his hand slowly, and for a brief second, I thought he needed help. But something about the way he didn't step aside, the way he didn't blink, told me otherwise. Jason rolled down the window. "Are you okay?" he asked, voice calm, attempting friendliness. The man didn't respond at first. He just stared at us, his eyes reflecting the beam of the headlights. Then, in a voice that was chillingly soft but firm, he said, "Get out." I froze. Jason's expression didn't change immediately, but I could see the tension building in his shoulders. "Excuse me," he asked, leaning slightly forward. The man repeated, "Out, now." The kind of command that brooked no argument, the kind of voice that triggers a primal, instinctual obedience. My heart raced, and I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. Jason hesitated, looking to me, as if searching for reassurance, but there was none to give. I was terrified. Suddenly, without another word, the man turned and started walking alongside the road. He didn't run, didn't shout, just walked, matching our pace as though the distance between him and the car was irrelevant. Jason, against my frantic protests, slowed the car even more, trying to assess the situation. My hands were shaking on the dashboard, and I could feel my pulse in my temples. There was an undeniable sense of danger in the air, one that didn't require weapons or aggression to be felt. The presence alone was threatening, a looming shadow of intent I could not understand. Then, as if realizing we weren't complying quickly enough, he raised his hand, and something glinted in the dim light. At first, I couldn't tell what it was, but as the reflection hit the windshield, I realized it was a knife. My stomach dropped, nausea twisting in my gut. The casual way he held it, almost like it was an extension of his arm, made it clear he knew exactly what he was capable of. Jason panicked. He tried to drive forward slowly, but the road had become slick with evening dew, and his hands were trembling. The man kept pace, silent but insistent. I remember the sound of the car tires on the asphalt, the rustle of leaves, and that strange, almost tangible pause in the world, as if everything else had receded to leave only the three of us and the impending threat. I considered opening the door, running into the forest, but the darkness was impenetrable, and the man's gaze was fixed on us. It wasn't just a stare, it was a calculation, a measuring of possibilities and weaknesses. I felt trapped, powerless, and acutely aware that this encounter was escalating beyond anything rational. Suddenly, Jason slammed the brakes. The car skidded slightly, and the man stopped in his tracks. We sat in silence, headlights illuminating his figure for a few tense seconds. He stepped closer to the car, bringing the knife up, pointing it directly at us. My hands were trembling so violently that I could barely breathe. I thought, in that moment, that this was the end, that this random figure, this stranger with intent we could barely comprehend, was about to decide the fate of our lives in the forested darkness. Then, as inexplicably as he appeared, He turned and walked away. No words, no explanation, just a slow retreat into the shadows. I don't know why he left. Maybe he had gotten the thrill he sought. Maybe he sensed we weren't worth the effort, but his disappearance was no comfort. We sat frozen, staring at where he had been until our shaking hands found the ignition. Jason turned the car around, heading back toward the main highway, silence stretching as we processed what had just occurred. By the time we reached the highway, our relief was palpable but incomplete. Neither of us spoke much, too aware of the lingering presence in our minds, too aware that what we had encountered was real, calculated, and terrifying. That night, we stayed at a roadside motel, locked the doors, and refused to leave until morning. Even then, I couldn't shake the sensation that eyes were watching us from the shadows, that the man, whatever he was, had not finished with us. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the dusty motel curtains, giving a false sense of security. We were alive, yes, but neither of us felt safe. My hands were still unsteady as I packed our things, and Jason's usually confident demeanor was fractured, replaced with a tense, watchful alertness. The memory of the man's slow, deliberate movements, the glint of the knife in the dim light, haunted both of us. Neither of us spoke about it as we checked out, too aware that words might only solidify the lingering terror. We continued eastward, taking the longer, main highway this time, sticking to populated areas. I couldn't stop replaying every detail in my mind. The way he had appeared from nowhere, the eerie calm of his voice, the absolute certainty in his stance. It was as if he had been waiting for us. I kept thinking about what could have happened if Jason hadn't slammed the brakes, if the man had decided to approach the car more aggressively. I didn't want to dwell on it, but it was impossible. By mid-afternoon, we stopped at a small-town cafe to eat. We both ordered coffee, something to anchor ourselves back into a sense of normalcy. As I stirred my cup, my eyes scanned the street outside, hyper, aware of every passerby. The memory of the man's calculated gaze lingered, and I noticed myself flinching at shadows. Jason seemed equally tense, glancing toward the door every few seconds as though expecting him to reappear. We avoided eye contact, both silently acknowledging that even talking about it might make the fear real again. We decided to split our journey into smaller segments, avoiding long stretches of isolated road. Every time we saw a side road leading into thick woods or an empty lot, I felt a pang of anxiety. It was as if the forest itself held secrets, and any shadow could conceal danger. The highway was safer, but the feeling of being hunted stayed with us. My phone had limited reception, and I texted our parents sporadically, making sure someone knew where we were at all times. Every ping from the map app or navigation system felt like reassurance, a lifeline back to civilization. Around early evening, we pulled off for gas and dinner at a small roadside diner. The sun was low, and long shadows stretched across the parking lot. As we entered, the familiar smell of frying food offered us small comfort. The waitress greeted us cheerfully, unaware of the tension behind our smiles. We ate in silence, occasionally exchanging brief glances that conveyed more than words ever could. Every sound seemed amplified, the clatter of dishes, the hum of the fridge, even our own breathing. It was as though the memory of the man had rewired our senses, making every detail hyper, real. After dinner, we returned to the car, and I insisted Jason check the surrounding area before driving. We walked the perimeter together, eyes scanning for any unusual movements. The parking lot was empty except for a few trucks, and for a moment, I allowed myself to breathe. Jason muttered something about how this was ridiculous, that we were letting our minds run wild. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we had barely escaped a threat far more sinister than we understood. Back on the road, the darkness pressed in. I sat quietly, focusing on the streetlights and the lines on the highway. trying to ignore the growing unease in my chest. Then, out of nowhere, headlights appeared behind us. A large pickup truck, too close, too fast, tailgating aggressively. My stomach dropped. Jason noticed immediately and began to drive cautiously, signaling for it to pass. But the truck stayed, matching our speed, riding our rear bumper in a way that felt deliberate. I could feel my hands shaking on my knees, gripping the seat as adrenaline surged through me. The memory of the man with the knife was fresh, vivid, and now mirrored in this new threat. Jason tried to keep calm, maintaining a steady pace, but the tension was palpable. The truck stayed close for miles, headlights blazing, and I realized we might be dealing with a continuation of the previous encounter. Fear clawed at my chest, the kind that makes rational thought impossible, replacing it with instinctual survival. As the minutes stretched, Jason considered turning onto a side road to shake the truck, but I protested. "We don't know where those roads go," I said, voice trembling. "We can't risk it." He nodded, silent, and kept driving. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror constantly, trying to catch a glimpse of the driver. The truck's windows were tinted, but every movement, every shift in its position felt menacing. I began calculating our options, mentally preparing for the worst-case scenario. After what felt like an eternity, the truck finally passed us, speeding ahead and disappearing into the night. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Jason didn't speak immediately. We both knew any conversation now could unravel into panic. The highway stretched on, illuminated only by our headlights and the occasional glow of distant towns. Yet, even with the immediate threat gone, the lingering sense of being watched remained. The encounter had changed something fundamental in both of us. Eventually, we reached a larger city, and the lights, traffic, and people offered a semblance of safety. We checked into a hotel near the highway, securing our room and locking the door. Sleep was nearly impossible that night. The shadows in the corners of the room, twisting into imagined figures. The memory of the knife-wielding man repeating in a loop. I lay awake, listening to the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic, trying to ground myself in reality, but the fear remained stubbornly present. The next day, we continued our trip, taking the safest routes possible, avoiding any backroads or areas that might offer isolation. Despite reaching our destination safely, the experience left a lasting mark. Every time we told the story later, we couldn't fully convey the intensity of the fear, the sense of imminent danger, the overwhelming feeling of helplessness that had dominated those hours. Friends and family listened, sympathetic but incredulous, unable to grasp the reality of the terror we'd felt. Even months later, I would wake in the middle of the night, the image of the man with the knife flashing in my mind. The fear had not left entirely. It had transformed into a wariness, a heightened awareness of surroundings, a respect for the unpredictability of strangers. The road trip, once a symbol of freedom and adventure, had become a reminder that danger often lurks where you least expect it, and that ordinary days can transform into nightmares in the blink of an eye. It was supposed to be the perfect summer escape. After finishing my second year of college, I convinced 3 of my closest friends, Maya, Liam, and Tom, to join me for a weekend trip to an old, supposedly abandoned lakeside cabin in upstate New York. The cabin had been owned by a relative of a friend of mine, and we'd managed to get permission to use it while they were away. No electricity, no Wi-Fi, no distractions, just the 4 of us, a secluded lake, and the kind of wilderness that felt like it existed outside of time. The drive there was filled with laughter and playlists of nostalgic music. We joked about ghost stories, tried to scare one another, and reveled in the kind of carefree energy only college summers seemed to provide. By the time we arrived, dusk was settling over the trees, casting long shadows across the gravel path leading to the cabin. At first glance, it looked exactly as I imagined: weathered wood, a small dock reaching into the lake, the faint smell of pine and decay mingling in the air. We unloaded the car, hoisted our bags onto our shoulders, and stepped inside. The interior was rustic, dusty floors, faded wallpaper, and a faint moldy scent, but it was cozy in its own way. The windows had thick layers of grime, filtering the remaining sunlight into dull orange streaks that fell across the room. We unpacked quickly, eager to settle in before it got dark. Maya found a stack of old board games in the corner. Liam examined the fishing gear left by the previous occupant, and Tom insisted on checking the perimeter of the cabin to get a lay of the land. As night fell, we built a small fire in the stone hearth. Shadows danced across the walls as the flames crackled, creating a sense of warmth that was both literal and psychological. We sat around, roasting marshmallows, telling stories, and joking about how this was the perfect off-grid experience. None of us could have anticipated how quickly the fun would take a sharp turn into something deeply unsettling. It started subtly the first night. Around midnight, I woke up to a soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I assumed it was Liam or Tom playing some prank, but the tapping persisted, faint and deliberate, coming from outside the cabin. I nudged Maya, whispering to her about the sound, but she was half asleep and shrugged it off. I didn't mention it to Liam or Tom. They were fast asleep, and I convinced myself it was probably just a branch hitting the window or some animal wandering too close to the cabin. By the second night, the sounds had escalated. Tapping became scraping, and occasional muffled thumps echoed from the perimeter of the cabin. We were no longer able to laugh it off. Liam, ever the skeptic, tried to dismiss it as the natural noises of an old building settling, but even he admitted it felt weirdly intentional. Maya had started to whisper about feeling watched, describing a sense of eyes on her whenever she stepped outside to gather firewood or take a late-night bathroom break. Tom, who was usually fearless, had grown unusually quiet, glancing nervously out of windows at shadows that seemed to linger a little too long. It was the third night that things went from creepy to terrifying. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of whispering. Not the soft, indecipherable murmur of wind through the trees, but human voices, low and indistinct, just beyond the cabin walls. My heart started pounding as I shook Liam awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He froze for a moment, listening, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's not the wind," he said, his voice tight with tension. We gathered in the living room, flashlights trembling in our hands, trying to convince ourselves it was a prank. Maybe a group of kids wandering too close to the lake. But as the whispering grew louder, punctuated by the occasional creak of floorboards outside, it became clear this wasn't a coincidence. Someone or something was near the cabin. Maya suggested calling the police, but there was no signal on our phones. No service, no Wi-Fi, nothing. We were completely isolated. The whispers became clearer, almost taunting. We could hear fragments of words: leave, now, alone, but they were distorted, like someone speaking through a wall of static. Panic started to set in. Tom, who had gone to investigate the source earlier, returned pale, faced, whispering that he saw movement near the tree line. Something tall, impossibly thin, lingering just beyond the reach of the flashlight beams. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the torch steady. We barricaded the cabin door with a heavy dresser, trying to reassure one another with false confidence. It's probably just a drunk hiker or some kids messing around. Liam said, but even he avoided looking out the windows. Hours passed like this, each of us jumpy at every groan of the cabin's floorboards, every crack of a branch outside. Sleep was impossible. By dawn, exhaustion had set in, but none of us could leave the cabin to rest. The feeling of being watched had become unbearable. When morning came, we tried to rationalize everything. Maybe it's a raccoon or some deer, Maya suggested weakly, but none of us believed it. The porch had muddy footprints, not animal tracks, but human, like, elongated and oddly misshapen. The prints led from the edge of the trees to the cabin door, then circled back into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. My stomach dropped. Whoever or whatever had been outside had been studying us all night. We debated leaving immediately, but the car had been parked too close to the dock, the keys inside. Moving it in daylight seemed safer, but the forest felt different in the morning, almost hostile, and the cabin itself radiated a kind of oppressive energy that made breathing difficult. We decided to wait until late morning to make a run for it, all four of us sticking close together as we ventured outside. The woods were eerily silent. Birds avoided our path, and the usual rustle of leaves underfoot sounded exaggerated in the unnatural stillness. As we approached the car, Liam noticed something engraved into the dirt beside the dock symbols, not letters, something ritualistic and unfamiliar. My hands were clammy, heart-hammering. We didn't dare investigate. Instinct screamed that curiosity would be fatal. As soon as we were in the car, the whispering returned, this time from the trees themselves, a chorus of unintelligible voices that made my blood run cold. Tom locked the doors and Maya drove, keeping the engine running, headlights cutting through the oppressive gloom. We didn't speak, too terrified to break the spell of fear that had wrapped around us. Every shadow seemed to move, every tree a potential threat. By the time we reached the main road, the sun was fully up, and the forest appeared normal, almost mundane. But we all knew what we had experienced was not natural. We never spoke of the cabin or the whispers again. Photos taken on our cameras revealed nothing unusual. No traces of movement. No shadows beyond the normal. Yet the memory remained vivid, a haunting reminder that some places harbor darkness beyond comprehension, and sometimes curiosity can bring you too close to something you were never meant to see. Even after we left the cabin behind, the memory of that night haunted us. Sleep became difficult for weeks. Every creak of the floorboards in our respective apartments, every rustle outside our windows, triggered the same primal fear that had gripped us by the lake. Maya refused to go on any trips that involved dense forests or isolation, and even Liam, who had always scoffed at horror stories, admitted he'd never felt fear like that before. Tom, stubborn as ever, tried to rationalize it, suggesting we had collectively imagined the entire ordeal due to exhaustion and overactive imaginations. But we all knew the truth. What we encountered that night had been very real. Months later, we tried to dig into the cabin's history. The relative who owned it seemed reluctant to share details, vaguely mentioning that the property had been in the family for decades, and that strange things had been reported over the years. Local legend, according to them, spoke of a hermit who had lived nearby long ago, known for practicing unusual rituals that frightened the townspeople. Occasionally, hikers or fishermen would vanish, never to be seen again. We brushed it off at first, thinking these were just stories passed down to scare children. But as we connected the dots, the symbols in the dirt, the whispers in the trees, the unnatural shapes and movements, it became increasingly clear that the legends might not be entirely fictional. The following spring, I visited the cabin alone. My intention was to understand, to rationalize, to prove to myself that the fear had been a trick of my mind. I parked my car a mile down the gravel path, trying to approach cautiously. The forest looked ordinary in daylight, the lake sparkling under the sun, birds chirping as if nothing had ever happened. I laughed nervously, shaking my head at my own paranoia. Yet as I stepped closer, I noticed the dirt near the dock symbols, identical to those we had seen months before, freshly etched into the ground. My stomach turned, my breath quickened, and I realized I was not alone. A sudden rustling from the trees made me spin around. Nothing appeared at first, just shadows between the trunks. But then I saw movement, something tall and thin, gliding almost imperceptibly through the woods, keeping its distance but following me, always at the edge of my vision. Panic surged through me. I ran toward my car, heart hammering, keys trembling in my hand. As I reached the vehicle, I glanced back once more, and in that brief moment, I swore I saw a face, or at least something that resembled one peek from behind a tree, eyes too dark, too deep, unblinking. I never returned to that cabin again, but even years later, I sometimes find myself replaying that night in my mind, wondering what exactly it was that we encountered. Was it the spirit of the hermit, some malevolent entity tied to the land, or simply a human presence that had stalked us with intentions we could not comprehend? I may never know, but the fear, that raw, primal fear, remains imprinted in my memory like a brand, a reminder that some places exist beyond the boundaries of normal experience, and that curiosity, no matter how innocent, can awaken forces that are better left undisturbed.